Chapter 14. The damned plains seemed to go on forever. They rode from sunrise until well after dark, navigating by the lunatic glow of the northern lights and stopping only after they were too tired to go any further. When they awoke the next day, they seemed no closer to the dark mountains and its surrounding forest. The warband rode beneath a sky of swirling cloud, forever shrouding the light of the sun. Night and day were merely different degrees of grey and black, shading from one to the other in a subtle, stealthy pattern that robbed the mind of any sense of time. Storms came and went, often blowing up without warning and passing just as swiftly. They no longer paused to wait them out, instead just huddling in their cloaks and spurred their mounts forward toward the elusive forest and the hope of shelter. Food was also becoming a concern. They were down to iron rations now, rock-hard biscuits and thin strips of dried meat, enough for one meal per Druki per day. They saw very few animals during the day, mostly dark shapes like vultures, soaring low over the hilltops in the distance. Once, one of the birds strayed too close to the column, and Lunara shot it out of the air with her crossbow. But when the hungry Druki cut the bird open, they found its guts riddled and squirming with pale worms. There were howls and hunting cries at night. Some sounded like the lions they'd encountered in the past, while others were like nothing the Druki had ever heard before. In camp, the Noglir would rise off their haunches and bellow a challenge when one of the creatures came too close, jolting everyone from fitful attempts at sleep and sending them scrambling for their weapons. Finally, Malus had ordered the Cold One's saddles removed and left them free to hunt every night. The huge beasts had to eat regularly, or even their legendary stamina would start to fail, and the Highborn couldn't imagine anything on the plains that could fight off an entire pack of hunting Noglir. From what he could tell, however, it didn't look as though they were having much better luck than the Druki. They were becoming increasingly short-tempered, sometimes snapping at their riders when approached with saddles and reins. Unless something changed soon, their aggressive behaviour would become a much more serious problem. The Druki took to sleeping in their saddles during the day, weaving drunkenly with their mounts' rolling gait. Malus pushed them as hard as he dared, both to reach the forest as quickly as possible and to keep the warband too tired to contemplate rebellion in the meantime. To the best of Malus's reckoning, it was their 5th day on the plain when they stumbled upon the tribesmen. Spite had been acting tense for close to an hour, sniffing the air and growling deep in his chest, but the Highborn had been too tired and hungry to consider the cause. Then he began to hear a faint clatter every time the wind shifted from the north. Finally, his fatigued mind recognized the sound for what it was. Steel clashing on steel. The sound of battle. After a quarter of a mile, the plain began to slope gently upwards, rising to a low ridgeline another half a mile ahead. The closer they came to the ridge, the louder the sound grew, punctuated now by screams and bloodthirsty shouts. The other members of the warband had heard it as well by this point, and several had their crossbows loaded and ready. As they ascended the ridge, Malus raised his hand and signalled for the knights to form into line. Just as they crested the top, a small part of his mind observed that they might have been better off sending a couple of scouts ahead to see what was happening before committing the entire force. The Highborn cursed quietly to himself. Exhaustion and hunger were getting the better of his judgment. The battle was effectively finished by the time the Druki edged over the ridgeline. More than a quarter of a mile away, the victors were surrounding the remnants of their foe and systematically slaughtering them. Bands of horsemen galloped about in the plains below, hemming in smaller groups of riders, and bringing them down with thrown spears and axes. Dozens of bodies, both horses and men, littered the churned earth. The warriors were human, from what Malus could tell, wearing furs and mismatched pieces of armour. They rode stout, shaggy ponies that seemed to make up for what they lacked in size with nimbleness and stamina. Near the centre of the swirling mass, Malus made out what appeared to be the remnants of a camp. The Highborn brought Spite to a shuddering halt. The Noglear pawed at the earth, excited by the presence of so much horseflesh within reach. "Van here!" Malus called as he wrestled with the reins. Obediently, the knight swung out of line and wrestled his cold one over to Malus. "My lord?" Malus indicated the battle on the plain with the point of his chin. "What do you make of that mess?" "Feral humans," the knight said at once. "Nomadic tribesmen by the looks of their ponies. We're close to their tribal lands, and I would guess this is a raiding party on their way back to winter quarters." Malus frowned. "Who are they fighting?" "One another," Vanir said disdainfully. "A falling out over plunder, I expect. They are close enough to their home range that some must have felt it safe to start cutting others out of their share." "Not so different from us, then," Malus thought. He tried to estimate the number of tribesmen on the field. At least 30, victors and vanquished combined. "Greater numbers, but poor armor," the Highborn mused. "Do you think they've seen us yet?" Just then, one of the Cold Ones reared onto his haunches. Its patience exhausted, and let out a hunting roar that the rest of the Noglear took up as well. By the time the Druki had their mounts under control, the plain was covered in rearing ponies and shouting, gesticulating nomads. "You were saying, my lord?" "Never mind. What will they do now?" Vanir seemed shocked that the Highborn would ask such a question. "Why, they'll attack, my lord," he said. "The nomads worship the Lord of Skulls. You see, here they come now." Sure enough, the tribesmen had gotten over their initial surprise, and now the raiders, all of them, apparently united against a common foe, had formed into a loose mob and were trotting their way. They waved bloody axes over their heads and shouted ululating war cries as they rode. "Very well, back in line, Vanir," Malus ordered, then stood in the stirrups. "Sahanashah! Crossbows ready!" he commanded. "2 volleys on my order, then prepare to charge!" Malus reached back and grabbed his own weapon, just as the nomads urged their ponies into a canter. They were nearly at the base of the ridge. At this distance, he could see that their faces were painted with a white paste that gave them the look of skulls. Thick heads of braided hair flapped wildly in the wind. Each rider, the Highborn saw, had a clutch of severed heads tied to the hair of their saddles. "Make ready!" he cried, lifting the crossbow to his shoulder. His eyes scanned the front ranks of the oncoming mob, looking for their chieftain. He settled on a huge nomad, riding a shaggy black pony and carrying a massive battle axe in one broad hand. The man's head had been shaved bald and tattooed with crude red sigils, and his face had more in common with a wolf than a man. As Malus watched, the nomad bared pointed teeth and let out a howl, and the horde spurred into a gallop. "Fire!" Malus cried, and the crossbow thumped in his hand. The wolf-headed nomad reeled in the saddle as a black-fletched bolt punched into his chest. He clung to the saddle for the space of 2 heartbeats. Then the great axe fell from nerveless fingers, and he pitched backwards onto the ground. The Highborn was already working the reloading mechanism with swift, sure movements, honed by years of hard practice. A half-dozen tribesmen had fallen, shot from the saddle or thrown from dying ponies and trampled by their fellows. The raiders were halfway up the slope now, streamers of blood trailing from their axes. Malus's crossbow clicked into firing position as he chose another target. "Ready!" he cried, hearing answering yells from his men. Malus picked a rider at random who was hefting a short throwing spear. "Fire!" The crossbow thumped and the bolt took the man in the throat, punching cleanly through and severing his spine. There was a bloom of red around the nomad's skull, and he toppled bonelessly to the earth. Malus hooked the crossbow onto the saddle and drew his sword. The humans were almost upon them. Blades rasped from their scabbards along the Druki line. Charge! The Noglir leapt forward with a frenzied roar. For a moment, it was all Malus could do to stay in the saddle as Spite leapt hungrily at the closest pony. The animal shrieked in terror and tried to swerve away, but the Cold One caught the pony by the throat and bit through in a fountain of hot blood. The rider was thrown forward by the impact, sprawling across the back of Spite's neck, and Malus buried his sword in the nomad's skull. Another raider swept past on the right and struck the highborn a resounding blow across his breastplate, knocking Malus against the back of the saddle and sending his sword spinning through the air. Grabbing the saddle, he spurred the Cold One savagely away from his impromptu meal and fumbled his second sword from its scabbard as he pulled himself painfully upright. Another rider galloped at Malus from the left. The highborn hauled left on the reins, pulling Spite's head into the nomad's path, and the Cold One snatched the man from the saddle. The raider screamed in rage and found the strength to hack weakly at the Cold One's snout before Spite bit through the man's torso and sent limbs and head tumbling to the ground. By now the raiders had swept past the Druki and were reining around at the top of the ridge. A dozen nomad bodies littered the slope, and one of the Druki lay in a crumpled heap. His famished Noglir had pounced on the first pony it reached and rolled downslope with its prey, crushing the rider to a pulp. Less than half the raiders were left, but the wild-eyed tribesmen showed no signs of abandoning the fight. Malus brought Spite around and spurred him back up the slope, and the nomads rushed to meet him. Once again, Spite lunged for the nearest pony, but this time the nomad was an expert rider, and mad with battle lust to boot. At the last moment, he jumped his pony over the Cold One's head, and Malus found himself staring wide-eyed at the animal's butchered legs and broad chest as the beast hurtled at him like a falling boulder. Before he could react, Spite caught the hurling pony's hindquarters in his jaws, and suddenly riders, mount and all were tumbling end over end back down the slope. The nomad's pony struck Malus a glancing blow and sent him flying from the saddle. He landed hard nearly a dozen yards away in a shower of dirt and grass, but the blow had very likely saved his life. Spite and the dying pony crashed past, the animal shrieking wildly in terror and pain. The raider fetched up close by, stunned senseless by the fall, and Malus leapt upon him while he was helpless, severing his head with a stroke of his sword. By the time Malus staggered back to his feet, the battle was over. Riderless ponies shrieked and galloped in every direction, some pursued by out-of-control Noglir as their riders cursed and wrestled with their reins. A dismounted nomad lurched down the slope at one of the Druki, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side. Malus watched Dalvar pluck a knife from his belt and send it in a glittering arc to bury itself in the back of the raider's skull. Lunara caught sight of Malus and trotted over, Van Heer following in her wake. Her own bone weariness had vanished in the thrill of the charge, and the wolfish grin on her face was the first he'd seen in days.
"A pleasant afternoon's diversion, my lord," she called.
"Any prisoners?" Malus asked. Van Heer shook his head.
"The tribesmen aren't the sort one captures. They'll fight with their teeth and the splintered stumps of their arms if that's all they have."
"Orders, my lord!" Malus snatched a handful of brown grass and started cleaning the blood from his sword as he surveyed the battlefield. "Dismount the warband and let the Noglir eat their fill. The men can plunder the camp while the Cold Ones gorge themselves. There are bound to be valuables among the tents, and the men have earned a reward. Then we'll take all the food we can find and be gone from here before nightfall."
Van Heer frowned. "If we let the Cold Ones stuff themselves, they'll become sluggish."
"When the Noglir get hungry enough, they turn on the weaker members of the pack. In this case, that's us. This was a gift," he said, taking in the battlefield with a sweep of his sword. "I want to take as much advantage of this as possible, because who knows when we'll have so much meat on hand again." The knight considered this and shrugged.
"As you wish,"
he said, and turned his mount back upslope. Lunara watched him go.
He looks disappointed.
Malus shrugged. He might well be. With their bellies full and their pouches heavy with gold, the men will have less reason for slitting my throat tonight. True enough, she said, then looked down at the highborn with a wry smile.
Of course, there's always tomorrow.
The retainer then turned her own mount around and headed off to issue Malus's orders. The city seemed to appear from nowhere. One moment there was nothing but arid plains and a steely grey horizon, and then they were crossing a low ridge and the ruins were rising into the sky to the north, less than half a mile away. The Juruki sat in their saddles on the reverse slope and tried to make sense of the thing. We couldn't see it before because of the dust, Malus thought. Nothing else makes sense. But then, this is the wastes. Malus fidgeted with the scarf pulled over his nose, and another gust of wind sent a billow of dust and sand into their faces. It had been days since they'd left the nomad camp behind them, and the terrain had gone from grassland to cracked earth and clouds of dirt. The gusts of wind were hot and stank of sulphur, like breaths of air from an open furnace, even though the heavy grey clouds overhead threatened snow. The mountain, at least, appeared closer now. At least, Malus believed it did. He was no longer certain. Well, Van Heer, what do you make of that? Van Heer sat to Malus's right, holding his scarf to his face.
I don't know what it is, my lord,
he said, shaking his head.
We never roamed this far north when my household hunted the humans.
He paused, studying the toppled walls and broken towers in the distance.
It appears deserted, at least. I don't see any signs of activity. Perhaps it's a demon city Erhan Beg spoke of outside the White Hallows.
If the place is deserted, I don't care who built it, Lunara said irritably. She sat her mount to Malus's left, her hood pulled up over her head and her night mask protecting her face. I'd fight a demon if it meant getting out of this damn dust storm for an hour or two. Malus considered his options. The ruined city did appear deserted, but such an impression could easily be deceiving. It looked to be the size of Hag Reif, and 100 raiders could shelter there with no one the wiser. Still, if someone built a city in this place, there must be a well in there somewhere, he said, and we're running low on water. The Highborn bit back a curse, trying to force his exhausted mind to function. He wished he had enough men to risk a patrol, but their numbers were so few now that risking 1 or 2 Juruki was tantamount to risking the whole party. Let's go, he said, collecting spite reins. Like Lunara said, at least we can get out of the dust for a while. It took nearly half an hour to cross the dusty plain and reach the broken walls of the city. As ever, distance and time in the wastes were deceiving. As they drew near, Malus and the Juruki saw that the piles of stone, a dark veined marble all at odds with the barren nature of the plain, were deeply weathered. Statues that might have stood for thousands of years had been eroded down to vague man shapes, and only faint shadows remained of the carvings over the high vaulted gate. Drifts of sand piled in small dunes along the empty streets, and many of the buildings they could see were little more than piles of rubble. Malus's hackles rose as they rode down the short passage between the inner and outer gates, but the narrow murder holes overhead were long choked shut with sand and dust. Beyond, they emerged into a refuse-strewn courtyard. Weak light gleamed along the cobblestones. They were a dark green, polished to a kind of translucence that gave them the look of ornamental glass. The Highborn pointed toward a cluster of spires near the center of the city. "That must be the citadel," he said. "That will be the most likely place to find a well or cistern." Spite growled, his broad nostrils flaring as he tasted the air. Malus studied the shadowy alleys between the buildings and the gaping doorways, but he could discern no imminent threat. "Too long out on those cursed open plains," he thought. "The narrow city streets make me feel like I'm threading a needle." The small column worked its way through the ruins. The warband was tense. They'd seen enough unexpected danger to become wary of everything they encountered. But their only companion in the city seemed to be the relentless wind, stirring up a pile of choking dust wherever they went. Navigating the city proved surprisingly difficult. They had gone barely 100 yards down one narrow street when they found their way blocked by a channel almost 30 feet deep and more than 50 feet wide that ran from left to right as far as the eye could see in either direction. The sides of the channel were smooth and vertical, and the road they were travelling on met a cross street that paralleled the rim of the channel. "Some kind of defensive construction, perhaps?" Malus thought. "A ditch to delay the progress of invaders." He frowned, unable to see the sense of it. He turned the column to the right and began searching for a way across the gap. After another 100 yards, the Juruki found a narrow bridge spanning the gap. Though as far as Malus could tell, the span would be a poor spot to defend in the middle of an attack. He led the column over the decaying structure, and his roving eye caught sight of carvings along both sides of the bridge. The marble was carved with the sinuous image of sea dragons, their graceful arcs lending the appearance that they were leaping from one end of the ditch to the other. Not a ditch, Malus suddenly realized. A canal! The column encountered 2 more such canals as it worked its way deeper into the city. In the last dried-up watercourse, they found the remains of a ship leaning drunkenly to port, with its splintered masts hanging over the far side of the canal. How long ago had this city sat at the edges of a great sea? Malus shook his head in wonder. Farther into the centre of the city, the buildings were in better condition. The streets were narrow and winding, reminding Malus somewhat of distant Clark-Arond, and the sheer bulk of the structures seemed to lend them more resilience against the constant wind. There were statues of leaping sea dragons and mosaics of coloured stone depicting underwater scenes, or so the Highborn supposed, given all the depictions of fish and eels. One mosaic in particular held his eye. It showed a city beneath the water, its broad streets travelled by fish and serpents and other creatures the Highborn couldn't easily identify. The image disturbed him, but he couldn't explain why. The buildings themselves were expertly constructed, of the same dark veined marble they'd seen around the city gate. The sheer expense of the construction was staggering, to say nothing of the effort that must have been required to quarry so much high-quality stone and carry it to the site. The structures were made almost exclusively of stone. Malus saw very little wood of any kind, which hinted at a degree of craftsmanship that rivaled that of the dwarfs. Yet no dwarf had lent a hand to the construction of this place. The buildings lacked the broad, squat solidity of their structures. Of course, Hag Grave was built by dwarf slaves, to Juruki specifications, the Highborn mused. Could not the same thing have happened here? Logically, it was possible, but some instinct told Malus that it wasn't the case. Someone else had built this city by the sea. Perhaps it had been the craftsmen of old Anarian, but if so, the secrets of their trade had died with them many millennia ago. It took almost 3 hours before the column found its way to a large square that lay in the shadow of the city's central fortress. Like the city gates, the entrance to the citadel lay wide open, its defenders long since departed. The castle, with its tall, narrow spires, reminded Malus somewhat of the Hag, or of a forest of coral rising from the seabed, the Highborn realized, somewhat uncomfortably. The citadel as a whole was in better condition than the rest of the city. The riders emerged into another sand-choked courtyard, but the high walls mitigated the wind somewhat, and Malus recognized an intact barracks and forge set against the inside of one of the outer walls. "Stand!" Malus commanded, and slid gratefully from the saddle. Spite remained tense, his powerful shoulders hunched and his nostrils flaring with each breath. "Van here!" Malus said as the rest of the warband reined in. "Take a man and stand watch over the mounts. The rest of us will see if we can find some water." They draped water skins over their shoulders and combed the courtyard for more than an hour, searching the barracks and forge, and discovering kitchens, stables and storehouses, but no sign of a well. The silence of the place began to weigh on Malus. Every so often he would catch himself staring up at the narrow windows of the citadel's central keep. The hackles rose on the back of his neck, and he was certain that he was being watched. Their steps echoed in the empty buildings. Not even rats stirred at their approach. Finally, there was no place left to search but the keep itself. They returned to the Cold Ones and gathered 3 lanterns. Then the 5 Juruki made their way inside. Past the open doorway, the drift of sand rapidly gave way to a floor of slate tile that echoed with every step. Malus led the way, lantern held high. They walked through a succession of great halls filled with piles of dust and broken statuary. Mounds of old bones lay in some corners, hinting that the citadel might have been home to some predator in the past. Pale witchlight from the lanterns picked out mosaics of more underwater scenes, lining many of the walls in the great rooms. Once again, Malus saw depictions of undersea cities, this time people with vague figures that bore the heads and arms of men, but the bodies of fish or serpents. Several mosaics featured rakish sailing ships battling what appeared to be a huge kraken. Shining figures in pale green armour hurled lances of fire into the monster's eyes, even as the kraken wrapped their thorny tentacles around mast and hull. Every now and then, the Highborn thought he heard furtive sounds among their echoing footsteps. The shuffle of feet or tentative steps from the deep shadows of a side passage or a branching chamber. Beyond their globe of lantern light, the search party moved through an echoing abyss, its boundaries only dimly and infrequently glimpsed. Lunara seemed to sense it too. She walked at the rear of the party, with a naked blade in hand, her face a mask of concentration. Finally, they crossed another great hall that might have once been an audience chamber. No throne remained on the dais at the end, if ever there had been one. Beyond, they found a series of empty rooms and a flight of stone steps leading down into deeper darkness. Malus stood at the top of the stairs and took a deep breath, holding his lantern high. Among the heavy pall of dust and mildew, the air had a cool, damp feel to it. He turned to pass the news to the rest of the party, but the words died in his throat. They were deep in the citadel, surrounded by stone and echoing blackness, and a part of him feared to speak. He didn't know what else might hear and come looking for the source. The Highborn led the way downwards, sword in hand. The stairs descended into a cavern-like cellar, with columns of veined marble supporting vaulted stone arches. Carvings of sea dragons spiraled sinuously up the columns, and the close-set flagstones were more pieces of dark polished glass. In the flickering witchlight, the floor gleamed like a seascape in the moonlight. Try as he might, Malus couldn't catch sight of any walls. The chamber stretched off in every direction. But he could smell the water now. The moisture hung in the air of the chamber.
"Spread out,"
the Highborn said quietly,
"and watch where you put your feet."
Within minutes, there was the sound of shifting stone. Then Lunara whispered,
"Here, I found it."
Malus and the other Druki converged on the retainer, who stood by a broad, circular opening in the rock floor. She had pulled aside a stone cover carved with a seashell design to reveal the water's still surface, only a few inches below the lip. Another of the retainers was taking a tentative sip under Lunara's insistent eye as Malus approached. The Druki warrior nodded tentatively to Lunara, who in turn addressed her lord.
"It appears to be safe to drink."
"Good," Malus replied tersely, shrugging his water skins off his shoulder.
"Let us fill the skins and be gone. I don't like the feel of this place."
The water party bent to the task. Malus fought the urge to turn in slow circles and peer warily into the gloom. It wouldn't achieve anything except make the others nervous, so he forced himself to be still and wait. As tense as he was, the Highborn still didn't hear Dalvar slip silently up beside him.
"My lord,"
Dalvar murmured,
"I found something that I think you need to see." "What?"
Malus asked, but by the time he turned around, the retainer was already slipping away into the darkness, heading deeper into the chamber. Frowning, the Highborn hurried after him, lantern held high. He followed Dalvar for the space of several heartbeats, drawing farther and farther away from the cistern. Then, abruptly, the retainer came to a halt.
"Watch your step, my lord,"
Dalvar said quietly.
"The footing is uncertain here."
Malus stepped to the edge of what appeared to be a large sinkhole. At some point, possibly hundreds of years in the past, a large section of the floor had collapsed into a cavern beneath it. Peering down, the Highborn could see piles of glassy rubble and tall stalagmites pushing up from the cavern floor nearly 15 feet below. The Highborn studied the area with wary eyes.
"I don't see what's so important,"
he said.
"That's not what I wanted to show you, my lord,"
Dalvar said, nearly whispering in Malus's ear.
"This is."
The point of the dagger slipped effortlessly into the skin beneath the Highborn's right ear. It was an assassin's blade, razor sharp. Malus barely felt the tiny pinprick, but the message it sent was clear. Don't move, it won't do you any good.
It is said that in the city of Harganeth, assassination can be seen as a gesture of respect. Even admiration,
Dalvar whispered.
It's also an expression of art. The act itself is not as important as the manner in which it is executed. Of course, such art can only be appreciated by a single spectator, and if the execution is successful, it is their very last experience the spectator ever has. It is sublime, you see.
Malus said nothing. His sword was in his hand, but Dalvar stood very close, effectively trapping the blade.
Consider the tableau set before you, my lord. A single twitch of my arm, and the dagger will penetrate into your brain. Death will be instantaneous, almost painless. if that matters to you. Best of all, the heart will stop, so there will be little or no blood from the wound. A smudge of dirt from my thumb would render it invisible. You then collapse onto the rocks below, and I tell the others you were tired and careless and fell over the bridge.
Lunara will kill you,
Malus said. Perhaps, perhaps not. She is loyal, but pragmatic. Each warrior who dies is one less sword to help fight her way back home. Either way, that's my risk to take, not yours. You will be past caring. The dagger pressed fractionally deeper into the highborn's neck. Now, do you appreciate how precarious your life is at this moment?
Oh, yes,
Malus replied. He was surprised at how calm he felt.
Excellent,
Dalvar replied, and the dagger was suddenly gone. Now, you will hopefully appreciate the fact that I have no interest in taking advantage of this opportunity. Malus turned slowly to face Dalvar. The sword trembled in his grip.
You have an interesting and possibly fatal way of making a point,
he said. The retainer shrugged.
I could think of no better way to allay your suspicions, my lord. If I had any interest in killing you, I could have done so just then with minimal risk.
Malus gritted his teeth. It was an infuriating notion, but also an accurate one.
All right. What is your interest then?
Survival, Dalvar said simply.
Not to put too fine a point on it, my lord, but I believe you have been deceived. And Nagaira has sacrificed me and my men to lend that deception extra weight.
The Highborn's eyes narrowed suspiciously.
How do you know this?
Dalvar shrugged.
I don't know for certain, but several assurances my mistress made to you, and me, incidentally, haven't proven true, have they? The skull isn't leading us anywhere, and Uriel had those riders on our trail almost as soon as we'd left the Hag.
So what does she gain from all this?
She hurt both you and Uriel in one stroke. You've taken one of Uriel's most prized possessions and carried it far beyond his reach, on a dubious expedition into the Chaos Wastes. Even if you survive, your half-brother will bend all his energies towards destroying you. And you have no allies within or without the Hag who will aid you. This, incidentally, also keeps Uriel too busy to continue harassing Nagaira. She was very angry with you for sneaking away on your raiding cruise this summer and abandoning her to his attentions.
Uriel has to know she helped me invade his tower. Dalvar shrugged.
Perhaps, but you have the skull, and she doesn't. Also, he lusts for her.
And she would sacrifice her closest lieutenant and 5 retainers just for the sake of deception?
As I said, she was very angry.
Malus took a deep breath and composed himself.
All right. What do you want? Want? I don't want anything. I'm offering you my service.
The Highborn blinked. What would I want with a rogue like you? Dalvar's mocking grin reappeared.
Come now, my lord. Your chief lieutenant is a woman. You've got a knight in your servants you won on a bet. And if the rumors are true, you're sheltering a former assassin who fled Cain's temple. You've as much use of rogues as the next Highborn. And you're not so careless with their lives.
Malus considered this.
All right. What can you tell me about Van here, then?
What treachery is he planning?
Treachery? None, my lord.
You expect me to believe that?
Malus snapped. Of course, the retainer replied. I think you've misjudged the man, my lord.
Really? How so?
He's not about to betray you, my lord. Van Heer is a proud and honourable man. Hasty and impetuous, perhaps, but proud and honourable nevertheless. He's not the sort to slip a knife in your back or slit your throat when you sleep. No, he'll fulfill his oath and return to the Hag, and then dedicate the rest of his life to destroying you, one small cut at a time. And he'll make certain you know he's the one that's doing it the whole time. In fact, I suspect the two of you are much alike. Malus thought it over carefully, and was pained to admit that the rogue had a point.
What about your men?
Dalvar spread his hand. They belong to me now, not her. They'll do as I say. The Highborn nodded.
Very well. But remember this. As you so cleverly pointed out, I have the skull, and I mean to claim the power behind it, no matter how many of you have to die in the process. I'll walk out of the wastes alone, if that's what it takes. Do you understand me?
Dalvar bowed deeply. I live and die at your command, my lord.
My lord?
Lenara's voice echoed across the cavernous space, tinged with mild concern.
We've filled the water skins. Is everything all right?
All is well,
Malus answered, meeting Dalvar's eye.
We've got everything we need. Let's head back up.
Malus led the way back up the stairs, alternately seething and calmly considering his next move. His suspicions about his sister seemed to have been confirmed, and the thought galled him to the core. But she'd overplayed her hand. Her retainers belonged to him now, and soon so would the power in the temple. His footsteps quickened through the dark and empty halls, and he grinned savagely in the blackness. If anything, his position was even stronger than before. The party was just short of the citadel door when the ambusher struck.